Hi, welcome to episode 3 of the Sustainable Conversations podcast. I'm Robert Timms, Director of Earth Capital. I'm delighted to welcome my guest today, which is Tim Naylor, who is the founder of ClimateTech Engineering. Welcome, Tim, and it's a busy London Climate Action Week as well, I think, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. Thanks very much for making time. Lovely to be here.
No problem. I guess just to get started, maybe you can tell us a bit about yourself, what inspired you to start ClimateTech Engineering, what you do, and what's the sort of the journey that brought you here, and what you do as part of ClimateTech Engineering.
Sure, no problem. I studied information science when I was at university. I then joined a large enterprise software company called Oracle and was responsible for a number of its businesses over a period of 20 years across Asia Pacific and Europe, Middle East, and Africa, particularly incubating a lot of the innovative new startups and enterprise acquisitions that Oracle made. I grew global account teams, was involved with a lot of digital transformation projects with all of our customers across a whole raft of different industries. In the last 9 years, I was working for a renewable energy company setting up the digital business in Europe, and that was wind energy, solar energy, smart grids, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, microgrids, all of the sort of the digital part of the optimization of critical energy infrastructure. And then I left at the beginning of 2024 to start my own climate tech engineering venture, which was investing and advising hot new climate tech startups, which is what I enjoy doing, and I'll be doing a lot during Climate Action Week in London here.
That's great. So you've gone from working with some of the biggest companies in the world to presumably now relatively small startup, sort of hungry, agile businesses. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, it's really interesting actually because they have a lot of the same problems, and they don't have the same resources or strategies, therefore. A startup might be starved of resources, have a mile-long to-do list, but be able to pivot and move very agile in an agile way to take advantage of new opportunities. Whereas an established company might have loads of resources, loads of personnel and structure and finance, but they really struggle to innovate. So I think it's quite interesting the different strategies that play out with organizations of all sizes. I would say the exciting thing about working in climate tech is that actually the people that you meet are not only expert at what they do, but very generous with their time and wanting to both do good for the planet, but also help each other out. I think that feeling of goodwill is a very special thing about climate tech and clean tech.
So you think that comes from the sort of the purpose-driven nature of what people do? It's not there's a sort of an incentive. I'm sure they generally want to make money out of it, but they want to solve the world's biggest, arguably the world's biggest challenge at the moment.
Yes, I think that there's a degree of generosity because of that aligned purpose. It's a little pointless squabbling over, resources, limited resources in industries which perhaps aren't contributing to a greater purpose. And I think climate tech engineering was set up in order to help those companies try and grow faster, to realize their potential faster than they would have otherwise. And I think I'm not alone in that. That's the exciting thing. There's a lot of other people, a lot of conveners of networks, a lot of startup accelerators and incubators, all with that same purpose. So that's quite exciting. Climate Tech Week in London brings together a lot of those people.
Yeah, okay, that's great. And so in terms of the businesses that you work with presently or invest in or advise, you mentioned that sort of big and small companies alike have similar problems. Are there, within the sort of the climate tech space, are there sort of particular issues or challenges, obstacles, hurdles that the businesses you work with sort of tend to face? And similarly, are there any sort of success factors that they will have in common that drive them forward?
Yes, so most of the businesses that I work with are at the sort of post-bootstrap, pre-seed or seed stage of their growth trajectory. So they're typically pretty tight on cash. They have to make difficult choices with what they prioritize. I think the growth actually presents challenges for companies of all sizes, but because of the lack of resources, that brings a necessary sharpness of focus to the founders of clean tech companies and startups. I think the thing that helps those organizations is staying very close to the customer problem and solving that. That customer experience is I think really helpful, even to the point of being essential to focus the entire resources of the organization to create great customer value. And whether you're a business which is helping decarbonize residential properties through smart energy retrofits, or you're developing new sustainable packaging materials, or a new cold chain logistics technology, there's all sorts of ways in which you can be inundated with requirements. But if you strip things back and start from the customer problem, creating customer value, suddenly things become a lot clearer. Are you actually contributing to that? Or is this a sort of a compliance or a tick box exercise, or maybe something on the periphery that isn't perhaps quite as important? So I think staying close to customers, making sure in your pitches to investors and other stakeholders that the customer voice comes through very clearly, that market traction is really, really important.
Yeah. Well, one of the things people often sort of criticize some startups for, not just in the climate tech space, but in general, is that sometimes sort of founders they create a business based on solving a problem that doesn't really exist. They've come up with an idea that they think is a great idea, but there's no actual evidence that people are prepared to sort of pay to use that idea, as it were. How do you sort of work with the businesses you advise, sort of make sure that there is a custom fit, bearing in mind, as you said, they're often sort of pre-seed, sort of bootstrapped. They maybe not don't have any customers yet, and they may not be able to get to sort of commercial traction for several months, if not a year or two. How do you make sure that they stay focused on actually what the customer actually needs, as
So
opposed to they think the customer might need?
even pre-revenue businesses will be able to have some element of customer traction. It could be being part of a research consortium to prove out the commercialization of an interesting, novel proprietary technology. So being able to assemble industry partners or academic institutions that have a lot of credibility in this space, that's a good indication that there will be commercial traction at the end of it if the technology is proven in the research phase. Most of the companies that I work with are past that phase. They are actually at the early stage of post-revenue. So they've got some early adopter customers. Early adopter programs is a great way to bring forward revenue. Research partnerships, again, attracts grant funding and commercial funding. So these are all sort of precursors or foreshadowing some of the investment that might come later on, government grants or government tenders or corporate venture capital money coming in, because it won't be the mass market that recognizes a good innovation or a good particular piece of technology or a solution. It'll be the early adopters. So I think for founders of climate tech companies, locating those early adopters that are prepared to do something now, that's a pretty essential skill to have. The startups that I work with, I think, are doing quite a good job of scanning the horizon, looking at the incumbents, looking where the opportunity is, and then finding peers who are also seeking that same opportunity. And that is the way that you start to create a critical mass of resources, and the business, I think, can snowball from there.
Yeah. And in terms of finding early adopters, like you say, you can scan the market and competitors and gaps in the market and so on. Many businesses fall into a bit of a sort of a trap of kind of pilot hell, where they get on a pilot customer who sounds brilliant. They spend a year working with them, prove out the solution, and then at the end of it, that customer says, "Well, I don't have the money to spend on this anyway."
Yeah.
Do you have any sort of strong views on sort of how to sort of advise
Yes.
businesses on piloting and sort of early adopting and
I do, yeah. So I don't like pilots. The point of a pilot is not to complete a pilot. The point of the pilot is to evaluate commercial and technical viability for a full-scale rollout. So the objective is full-scale rollout because that's where you get the benefit. A pilot is principally cost to the supplier and cost to the company doing the pilot. So you want to get either through that sort of commercial technical due diligence as quickly as possible. If you can avoid a pilot, brilliant. You know, I think that if you are having to do a pilot, make sure that it's a paid pilot, reflecting accurately the costs that you're putting into it. That will also streamline the process by converting pilots to paid commercial opportunities and longer term contracts. So I think just stepping back from pilots, which are quite often a way for large commercial organizations to de-risk, or public sector organizations to de-risk investments, what it does actually is it increases their costs. So if you can minimize that sort of commercial and technical due diligence by taking out the key sort of elements that they're wanting to test, and either having third-party validation or testing available, certification. If you want guaranteed commercial fit, include the commercial terms of the full rollout in your pilot agreement. And the pilot agreement would need to be a sort of a contingent agreement. If we prove this, this, and this during the pilot, then it will convert to a paid subscription or a paid full rollout with these volumes, and here are the guaranteed prices. It provides assurance, it de-risks the leap of faith that the organization is taking by setting out everything quite clearly as to what a complete rollout would be. That's the aim of implementing new technologies, because that's where the benefit is. Everything else is just cost. So streamline that as much as possible.
So that sort of, yeah, I guess pre-negotiating of the commercial terms up front, it might, particularly the bigger the company you're dealing with, may take a lot longer in terms of going through procurement and all that kind of stuff. But in your view, it's worth doing that
Yes.
up front,
Yeah.
taking that time then, rather than risking getting to the end and only at that point realizing that there's no chance of agreeing a commercial sort of relationship moving forward.
Yes, I think one way to do that is just work out, what it is that you are going to want to achieve during the pilot, and ensuring that there's the right support for stakeholders there. There has to be, in the agreement of a pilot, which is an agreement between at least two parties, there has to be the agreement that this will lead to something other than just completing the pilot. I think a lot of maybe critical of innovation funding in the UK, particularly public sector based innovation funding, in that it is very focused on the innovation activity and a lot less focused on the commercialization and scaling up of that tech post grant. I think it wastes a lot of public sector funding, unfortunately. So the objective, I think, is the scaling up of the technology, the implementation and full rollout. I think trying and minimizing the costs associated with piloting and sampling, and ensuring up front that there is enough alignment of the stakeholders so that they're prepared to say, well, if this is successful, we want to roll this out at scale, and this is what that looks like. And so that you effectively pre-agree the terms of the rollout up front. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and getting the right people in the room. And so you talked a bit there about sort of public sector funding and some of the sort of the limitations of it. What sort of mix do you see in terms of helping the sorts of businesses that you advise, a sort of balance between sort of private sector sort of investment and advice versus public sector sort of grants and things like that, versus of course research and academic input? Do you have what sort of, is there a sort of a set route that founders should follow? Should they, people often say that at the very early stage start try and get government grants. If you're a spin out from university, obviously there may be some options around that. But does sort of private sector investment naturally come second, or do you feel that it shouldn't be such a set rule for pre-revenue businesses?
I think that private sector investment can come at any stage. I think grant funding can be super important for founders who want non-dilutive funding, particularly if that can coincide with achieving certain technical or commercial milestones for the business. So if grant funding can also be quite useful in bringing together collaboration partnerships, often helping startups punch above their weight in attracting commercial partners or academic research partners or third-party certification bodies. That important role of convening a community who are all excited about the potential of a new idea or new technology. Grants can be brilliant at doing that. And that can also help crowd in private capital. People who are investing in new technologies want to see capital efficiency first and foremost. That's a key success indicator, but they also want to see sort of evidence of traction in the marketplace, the right community of practice being built, the right capabilities, the right sort of progression in technology readiness level. And I think that there can be a really nice coupling of private capital backing onto grant funding to help clean tech businesses to grow. I don't think that we're
Yeah.
quite there yet. I think that everyone wants that to work in a perfect way, but there's still work to do there. I would like to see much more public capital, so grant funding calls and things like that, and incentives. I would like to see that much more focused on the scaling up. So making the funding conditional on scaling up the technologies. And if you have been involved in receiving grant funding and have been repeatedly unsuccessful at scaling that up into a commercial product, then maybe you don't get to get more grant funding until you're actually doing the job of scaling up. I think that would be a helpful start.
Yeah, I personally, I quite like seeing when you have a sort of grant funding, that's, as you said, sort of conditional upon attracting private sector investment alongside it.
Yes.
So, a certain chunk of angel investment or VC investment or something that then unlocks the grant capital, because that sort of, to me, that kind of shows that we've got the sort of the public sector is taking some of the risk on the innovation part, but that also demonstrates that there is appetite commercially for investors to come in and make the scale. And if
Yes.
if they believe that they can make money out of it, then they believe that there's a commercial, there's traction to be had from clients at the end of the road. Or
That, That's a fantastic example of public sector money de-risking the private sector investment in a new technology that stands to benefit everyone, not just the investors, but some of the companies that I've invested in have great examples of that. One of the investments that I made early on was in a lithium extraction company in Cornwall, and
Mhm.
they have received a lot of government support. The thing that attracted me is the very innovative way that they are applying technologies to quite an old process. Lithium has been in Cornwall for, thousands of years, and we've known that it was in the mines in Cornwall for a long time, but the new ways of extracting it and getting it to market, and suddenly it's the key technology powering smart grids and electric vehicles, and having a domestic supply of that is absolutely brilliant for UK government and UK businesses. So there's lots of ways that public sector can help de-risk that sort of growth trajectory. I think that's a
Yeah.
great use of public sector incentives.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so you mentioned sort of lithium mining as one example. Are there any sort of particular technological areas in climate tech you think are sort of are hot or the right things to back at the moment that are sort of have the edge over other particular types of technology?
So when I started as an angel investor, I worked through Green Angel Syndicate, and I'm still a very enthusiastic member of that organization. Um, One of the companies that I invested in, when I came into investing, I thought I'm going to base my investment sort of envelope focusing particularly on companies that have an IT or data or digital element to them, because that's my experience. But once you start to see the enthusiasm of the companies pitching and the market traction, suddenly your eyes are open to a whole raft of different opportunities well outside your wheelhouse. I think the innovative thing that I keep on looking for in the pitches is, do they have a strong customer voice coming through the pitch? Like, have they got a great team? Have they got a great idea? Do they have strong evidence of market traction and growth? Can they scale? What's the defensibility of the technology? Those sorts of things are the things that I look for. So that has led me down a path where I'm investing in one of the company's early investments was in Kelpie, which is a company which manufactures waterproof packaging. They've won an awful lot of tenders globally in the consumer packaged goods space because they're replacing plastics in packaging, improving recycling. Another one was Vulcan, which was a domestic energy assessment and retrofit provider using the new government's new home energy model. What Vulcan has to do with Kelpie? Very little, except for the fact that they're ruthlessly focused on solving customer problems. And that really came through in their pitches. Another one, Cool Run, which is a Hubble company, and they are reimagining cold chain logistics. So when vehicles, which used to be diesel-powered lorries with diesel-powered refrigeration, used to deliver from warehouse to store, these perishable goods, suddenly with the electrification of those fleets, opportunities exist to have passively cooled units requiring no refrigeration, other than the unit itself being able to transport the goods, massively cutting cost and carbon in the handling of perishable goods for supermarket chains and logistics companies. Having a relentless focus on solving the customer problem is the thing in common across all of the investments. 18 months ago, 2 years ago, I don't think that I would have recognized that to the same extent that I do now. So it's not for me the sector that the organization is in or what geographic market they're playing in. It's have they got a great team, a great idea, and are they relentlessly focused on solving customer problem and adding customer value? That's the most important thing for me.
Yeah. And do you ever come across a company where you think, actually, I think the technology they're developing is fantastic, but the team is a bit weak? Maybe it's someone who's never run a business before. They're great scientists. They've got a great idea. Would you sort of step in and say, actually, through ClimateTech Engineering, I can provide support around making that team stronger? Or would you say, actually, I'll look for one that's got a really good team, and that's a sort of a given that they have to have a strong team in place before you start working with them?
Most organizations, it takes an awful lot to start a company. And I would say most startups that I work with have got good core teams. And I think, I don't see myself as being essential to their growth at all. And I think if I can help, I actually provide the advice to them. If I can help, there's no charge that I do for that. If some of them later want to work with me because they have a particular problem in mind, maybe it's around the revenue flow or risk and governance, particularly on the sales, the go-to-market, the customer traction piece, then sometimes I can help there. But generally speaking, I don't think the team is the core problem of most of the startups that I work with. Scale is a problem. So building out that team in the right way, that can be a little fraught. You can have missteps with hiring, but I don't think they're typically terminal. I think the thing that is essential and can't be missed is, focusing on the customer need and staying close to incubating that, and making sure that there is clear communication across all of the different parts of the team focused on solving that problem. Because if you have that clear view of how you're contributing to solving the customer need, it aligns all of the functions within the startup to that particular purpose. It creates a North Star, if you like, for organizations. And that alignment really helps make better use of investor capital, because very little, if you're starting with the customer problem and working your way back to creating a business that is designed to solve that helps focus investor capital in the right areas.
Absolutely. And then in terms of I mean, I think instinctively anyone who invests in a business sort of knows whether it's going well or not if they're reasonably close to it. But do you have, there's a lot of talk about sort of impact metrics and sort of measurement and everything from sort of carbon accounting to sort of all sorts of different scoring. We have a dividend model, Earth Capital, which helps sort of measure the sort of sustainability aspect of how a business is doing. So there's all sorts of things out there. But do you have a sort of do you have a sort of way of measuring the sort of impact of the businesses you're having, whether that is a sort of environmental aspect of it or purely do you tend to look more at the financial success of the business?
So financials are key. It's the lifeblood of an organization of any size, a startup particularly, because the tolerances of deviating from plan the consequences of deviating from plan are pretty significant. It can be an existential crisis if a business drifts off plan as a startup, whereas a large enterprise you might be able to have time to correct. I think I think that a lot of the time there will be a requirement to have certain regulatory reporting or carbon accounting, particularly operational carbon. I think that involves a lot of time and effort in pulling together those numbers. I'm not sure that all of the time and effort is warranted given the other priorities that the customer has. For me, the finance is important, but actually trust is massively important. It's not so much a KPI that you might find on a scorecard or it's an intangible, but understanding that the people in the business will do what they say that they're going to do. So when they make a forecast of revenue, the revenue comes in according to that forecast within the parameters, worst case, best case, and it's somewhere in the middle. If they say that they're going to spend money on these things, they spend it on those things. So being able to have trust in the founding team to do the job that is needed, I think you won't find on any report or KPI, but investing in these businesses, I say that's a really important sense to get from the companies that I invest in and work with. Can you be trusted to do the job that is required? Consistently delivering on plan. That's super important. I would say that's probably the most important thing that I look for after are they solving the customer need in a profitable way?
Great. So yeah, trust is key, and yeah, delivering against the projections they've got. And I suppose that's the big one of the great challenges, isn't with all startups. It's easy to make some projections. It's a lot more difficult to hit them. So I suppose that there needs to be a sort of a not necessarily moving target, but as reality perhaps gets in the way a bit, then working with them to adjust what their realistic projections are. If just something isn't working, then dealing with it, fixing it so it does work, or actually saying, you know what, we may just have to abandon this particular area we thought was going to be hot, and instead focus our time, effort, and money on this other section.
Yeah. And I guess that as you look at more pitches and you start to get experiencing what it takes to fundraise, what it takes to exit, get a return on that investment, you start to develop a sense of, these are the sorts of traits that you look for. Yes, there has to be enthusiastic and ambitious goals for the company, but there also has to be balanced with good governance and risk management and a very pragmatic approach to growing the business. Because you've not got a lot of time to be able to invest in other areas other than the core of the business. And I think that focus is particularly helpful to see for startups focusing on, let's not say that they're focused on 20,000 customers to begin with, they're focusing on three. And they're going to close three customers this month and five customers next month and seven customers the month after. So that's the sort of, can they be trusted to do the job immediately in front of them, I think is quite an important skill to have across the team.
Yeah, and I think for all founders, focus early stages anyway, for focus is incredibly difficult because all sorts of things you could do. There's all sorts of customers you could go after. Opportunistic things pop up, and sometimes you need to grab them, but other times you just need to say, we've just got to ignore these things here, or park them for next year, because otherwise we're just going to spend all of our time is going to get spread so thinly across all these different things that we're never going to get anything done. And it's quite difficult, I think, when you're a founder to say no to something that sounds like a great idea and say, no, we need to double down on this. And that's where maybe some external help from an advisor or a board or something can help them sort of keep a little bit, sort of resist temptation to do everything.
I think that that's right. Assembling a strong board and a set of advisors, I think, are critical sounding boards for keeping you on track and helping you avoid some of the common pitfalls. Most founders they might, and founding teams, they might have an awful lot of experience, 20, 30, 40 years experience doing particular things in their particular area, industries and areas of expertise. They've probably never founded a company, and they've certainly never founded the company that they're working in at the moment and scaling that up. So it presents, even despite all of their experience, it presents something entirely new. And that newness brings with it risk. That's why having an experienced team, you're a founder of a company, you've grown it and exited successfully. Having that experience and knowing, what pitfalls through that journey to avoid, and it helps you be able to advise them. I would say startups aren't generally short of advice. They can be short of good advice. And that's where having good boards and sifting out the sort of advice that you need right now from the stuff that is perhaps longer term or perhaps irrelevant. Yeah, I think being prioritizing the things that can help today, I think, is pretty important for founders.
Yeah, and then just finally looking at that longer term. So a lot of people describe the 2020s as the decisive decade when it comes to climate. And I think we're going to be touching on that in more detail in some of the later episodes in the podcast. But how optimistic are you? We're sort of halfway through the 2020s. How optimistic are you that we're going to solve these big challenges, or at least sort of mitigate some of the worst aspects? What's your sort of general feeling of optimism or pessimism regarding the next 5 years or so?
The next 5 years, I think, are the critical 5 years. Looking back in time, I think once we're into the 2030s, I think it will be abundantly clear that there is massive financial consequences and social consequences for us continuing down this path. And I think to avoid that, I mean, at the moment, you've still got a lot of people convinced, the vast majority of the British public are convinced that climate change is real, we're causing it, and we have to do something about it urgently. There are still people in business, some in government, but mostly in business, who are trying to profit off slowing it down. I think the next 5 years, a lot of that will be swept aside when the cost of insurance against climate risk becomes excessive and buries organizations, when the links between the people causing harm in the environment start to become a lot clearer, and there starts to be penalties directly associated with those organizations, class action suits, investor revolt, that sort of thing. I think that will be for sure happening a lot more in the 2030s than it is happening at the moment. So I think in general, I'm optimistic about our ability to address this. First of all, we've got all of the technology solutions that we need to solve the problem. I think we have to crowd and investor capital around the solutions that can scale and move the needle, so to speak. I think that we're at our best as people when we are at the brink, when we're forced with a realization that we have to change or perish. We're not good at changing in advance of that critical juncture. We're often good at changing after the fact that we've gone too far and actually we're putting our own livelihoods and our kids' livelihoods at risks. So that point at which you come to that realization will be different for every single person. I think the majority of people are already there. I think by 2030, there will still be people that don't think that that is going to affect them. But I think that you're going to be talking about low single digits by that point. And I think that real climate action is what needs to happen and will be happening in the next 5 years.
Fantastic. So as a human race, we leave everything to the last minute, but
Totally.
then we excel under pressure.
Yes. Yeah. You look at what the response that we did globally to COVID, we were able to do things that no one thought possible in a very short space of time and deal with the global pandemic. The climate change is like that, except a bazillion times worse and just happening over a longer period. So that's why we're struggling to sustain the amount of effort required now, because it's a frog boiling slowly in hot water. Some of us recognize it. Lots of us don't recognize what it will take to solve the problem, but the technical solutions are there. I think if there is, if I can leave on this conversation with a parting note, I think one of the areas that is very fertile for investors to look at is the synergy between different solutions. Because I think at the moment, in the early stages of climate technologies, you've got a lot of individual point solutions. Not many of them are joined up, particularly from a systems and process perspective. I think digital technologies can be great at tying things together and optimizing that. The advent of AI, particularly helpful in bringing that together. I think you'll start to see a lot more of those solutions in climate tech over the next 5 years.
Brilliant. Well, on that note, of general optimism, I think I'd like to say thank you very much, Tim Naylor, for joining us. And yeah, we'll look forward to catching up in the near future.
Sounds great, Robert. Thanks very much for having me. Have a good London Climate Action Week.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.